Hello viewers. When the costumes come out and the streets glow with pumpkin lights, Halloween feels like harmless fun, right? But behind the laughter and candy bags, there are real stories that prove some tricks go far beyond the treat. Tonight, we're diving into 5 terrifying true tales of trick-or-treating gone wrong. Stories so chilling, they'll make you think twice before answering a knock at your door this Halloween. To make things clear, I've never liked Halloween. I don't begrudge anyone else for enjoying it. I'm not some cold-hearted cynic, but every time I see those decorations go up and those oversized bags of fun-sized candy flood the stores, I'm reminded of something I've spent years trying to forget. Back then, I lived in a small apartment downtown in Hollow City. Whenever I wasn't working or hitting the gym, I was at my computer, my desk planted right beside the window on my left. And every so often, I'd find myself gazing out through that glass, just watching life roll by below. I wasn't a creep about it. I didn't stare at people or follow them with my eyes. It was more like people watching, wondering where they'd been, where they were heading, and what kind of stories filled their lives. I'd see folks wrapped in coats and scarves during the holidays, arms loaded with gifts or covered trays of food. By late summer, I'd watch the new college kids hauling their lives into apartments, dragging office chairs across the sidewalk, bags hanging from their shoulders. Then came Halloween. Depending on the day it landed, the streets would fill with costume-clad children parading from door to door, laughter bouncing between the buildings as they compared their outfits and candy hauls. And despite everything I've said about hating Halloween, I used to actually enjoy it once. I'd carve one of those tiny pumpkins, set it on my windowsill, and hang a cheerful orange and black Happy Halloween banner just above it. A bowl of candy always waited by my door, a silent invitation for trick-or-treaters. For a while, it became one of my favorite times of the year. I'd stand by that window during the first hour after dark, beer or coffee in hand, just watching the tiny ghosts, vampires, and superheroes drift through the city night. That was in 1992, and that year was the Batman year. The movie had exploded that summer, so I knew I'd see a dozen tiny Bruce Waynes parading down the street. But the sheer number of them that night was almost comical, an army of miniature. Dark nights sweeping through Hollow City. Occasionally, a lone Joker would break the monotony, purple blazer, green hair, wide grin, but Batman ruled the streets that year. Around 7 p.m., I finished my window watching and went back to my desk to prep for work. The kind of repetitive, dull stuff I'd done 100 times before. My eyes started to wander, as they always did when boredom set in. That's when I saw them, a group of kids moving past my window, trick-or-treat bags swinging from their hands. Out of habit, I turned to see their costumes, and to my surprise, not a single Batman among them. There was an Indiana Jones, complete with a hat and toy whip. But what really caught my attention was the kid dressed as John Rambo, black tank top, red headband, fake scars on his arms. I couldn't help but smirk, wondering how a 12-year-old even managed to watch a movie like Rambo, First Blood Part 2. Then again, I remembered my own younger self, sneaking and scheming just to get my hands on a VHS copy of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But just as I was smiling at that memory, Leatherface swinging that chainsaw like a maniac in the final scene, something outside shifted my mood entirely. A dark gray van rolled to a stop beside the group. I couldn't see the driver clearly, but I watched the kids pause and turn toward the open window, clearly responding to whatever he was saying. A second later, the man stepped out. He slammed his door, walked to the back of the van, and began opening the double doors. The kids followed, curious, cautious, heads tilted, while the man gestured animatedly, like a salesman pitching a deal. He looked ordinary. Average height, average clothes, nothing memorable about him. But as he stood there, pointing into the shadows of his van, I felt something in my gut tighten, a slow, creeping dread that told me something was terribly wrong. The scene looked cartoonishly suspicious. like something out of an after-school special about stranger danger. It was so obvious that it almost made me hesitate, because maybe it was too obvious. I didn't know the man, but maybe those kids did. Maybe he was a father or an uncle or a neighbor picking them up. There were 4 of them and 1 of him. No way he'd try anything insane in a spot like that. A busy side street with apartments, porch lights, and cars passing every few minutes. Still, that feeling wouldn't leave. The unease dug in deeper with every passing second. I told myself I was paranoid, that I'd feel stupid in 5 minutes when the guy just drove off with his kids. But then he opened the van's rear doors wider, and whatever he was showing them made the hairs on my arms rise. I turned fully toward the window, hand reaching for my desk phone, ready to dial 911, just in case. My thoughts battled each other. He's not going to grab anyone. You're imagining it, but another voice hissed back, get ready. Memorize that plate number. Then it happened. As one of the kids, the Rambo boy, leaned forward, trying to peek into the dark interior of the van, the man lunged. It was one fluid, horrifying motion. He grabbed the boy under his arms, yanked him off his feet, and dragged him into the van. The other 3 kids bolted, running as fast as their legs would carry them. I hit 911, heart pounding so hard I could barely speak. The van screeched away before I could read the full license plate, but I gave the dispatcher everything. The color, the make, the man's build, his clothes, even the way he moved. The dispatcher's calm voice on the line said officers were on their way, that I could relax, that they'd do everything they could. And for a brief, foolish moment, I believed her. But if they really did do everything they could, it wasn't enough. A few days later, the missing child posters appeared. The photo they used, that smiling face frozen in happier times, hit me harder than I can explain. I'd seen the exact moment when his life changed forever. To this day, I don't know if they ever found him. Part of me hopes they did. But deep down, I think he stayed missing. Declared gone, then quietly forgotten. I read somewhere that in the US, a child goes missing every 40 seconds, 500,000 every year. Most wander off and are found again, but many never return. I pray that boy wasn't one of them. But sometimes, when Halloween decorations start going up, when the city glows orange and the laughter of kids echoes down the streets, I remember that gray van disappearing into the dark. And I realize I had a front row seat to pure evil. Not the kind that wears a mask or hides in shadows, but the kind that drives calmly down a city street, smiling, waiting for the right moment to destroy someone's world. When I was in 8th grade, with Halloween creeping up on us, my friends and I started talking about whether we were too old for trick-or-treating. At 12 years old, we were right on that invisible line, not quite kids, but not yet teenagers either. We all knew that once high school started, showing up in a costume would earn us fewer candies and a whole lot more mockery. And then it struck us that year, 2002, would be our final Halloween. Our last time knocking on doors, for candy like we used to win everything, still felt simple. I won't bore you with the poetic speech about growing up and leaving behind childhood things, but I mean it when I say that realization hit us hard. Still, that sadness only made us more determined to make this last one unforgettable. I didn't have the long hair to pull off Aragorn or Legolas, so I threw together a hobbit outfit, brown coat, shorts, and a green blanket I turned into a cape. The best part was the pair of novelty slippers that looked like huge hairy feet. That sealed the look perfectly. My best friend Ryan, dressed as Harry Potter, easily the most convincing of all of us, because he actually had the scarf wand and robe to make it look legit. Then our other 2 buddies, Leo and Damon, him as Spider-Man and Shrek, Damon in particular, went all out, painting his whole head green, even dyeing his hair to match. He got full marks for commitment. Though with his skinny frame and missing Shrek ears, he looked more like a sickly alien than an ogre. We all gathered at my place around 5:30 that evening. After fixing the final touches to our costumes, my mom took a photo of us on the porch, a frozen memory I still treasure to this day. We looked so happy, so alive. But there's an innocence in that photo too, because none of us knew it was the last time we'd all be together. We hit the streets around 6. Halloween was always big in our neighborhood, but that year felt charged, special. A flood of kids in costumes paraded the sidewalks, parents following behind, and almost every yard had some kind of eerie display, fog machines, gravestones, glowing pumpkins. If candy were currency, business was booming. People were so impressed with our costumes that they'd toss us extra handfuls of sweets at nearly every door. Even the weird ones, like the dentist handing out sugar-free gum and toothbrushes, added to the fun. After 2 straight hours, we'd hit almost every house we could. Our bags were so full we could have fed an army. But even then, we didn't want the night to end. We kept wandering the streets, admiring the decorations, and arguing about the horror movies our parents wouldn't let us watch. It was one of those moments that, even back then, I knew I'd remember forever, that last glowing ember of childhood. Around 8:30, reality started creeping back. Damon and Leo both lived farther out of town, and their parents were due to pick them up at 9. So Richie suggested we start heading back so they wouldn't be late. Ryan looked disappointed, almost annoyed, but we all were. We knew what this meant. The last Halloween, the last time the 4 of us would be kids together. I noticed Ryan seemed quiet, upset, but didn't think much of it. That is, until we reached the corner where he usually split, off for home, and instead of turning, he just kept following us back toward my place. I asked him what he was doing, assuming maybe he needed a ride, but he just said he wasn't ready to go home yet. "There's gotta be some houses still handing out candy," he said. "I want my last piece of Halloween candy ever." I actually thought that was kind of poetic. A ritual. A farewell. But then he asked if I'd come with him after the others left. I was exhausted. All I wanted was to crash on the couch, eat a few chocolates, and maybe catch something scary on TV. Plus, it was a school night, so I told him no. Ryan didn't take it well. "You serious, dude? Our last Halloween and you're just gonna sit on your butt?" I told him I was tired. Even Leo jumped in. "Yeah, man, how much candy do you need?" But Ryan kept insisting. "It'll only take 30 minutes, he said. When I refused again, he snapped dot comma. "Fine, whatever. If you're gonna be boring, that's on you." The outburst caught us all off guard. Ryan wasn't the type to get angry. He was always the calm one. But that night, something in him felt different. Looking back, maybe it was the first sign of what was coming. As he walked away, I called out, asking where he was going. He said a street name, one we hadn't hit yet. About 15 minutes away, Leo muttered, "What's gotten into him?" We shrugged it off, went inside, and dumped our loot on the floor. Richie's parents arrived soon after, then Damon's. I ended up watching part of the original Halloween movie before heading upstairs to sleep. Before I drifted off, I thought of Ryan, wandering around in the dark, knocking on doors alone. I figured maybe he'd score big somewhere, that he'd show up the next day bragging about it. "Dude, you missed out," he'd say. But the next morning, I woke up to a text from him, sent just after midnight. It read, "Hello, meat pliers." I stared at it, confused. "Hello, meat pliers? What the hell did that even mean?" I replied, "Lo, what's that supposed to mean?" But never got an answer. At lunch, I asked Damon and Leo if they heard from him. They hadn't. They figured it was one of his weird jokes. I tried calling him later that afternoon, but he didn't pick up. After a few attempts, his mom finally answered the home phone. She said Ryan was sick. "Figures," I told the guys later. Idiot probably ate too much candy. We laughed, assuming he'd be back in school Monday. But Monday came, and no Ryan. His phone was off. I called again Tuesday. Still no answer. When his mom finally picked up, she said the same thing. He's still sick, and that's when something in my gut started to twist. She sounded off, like she was hiding something. I mentioned it to the others, and by midweek, they agreed something strange was going on. We hadn't heard a single word from Ryan, no calls, no texts. It felt wrong. By Thursday, I couldn't take it anymore. I rode my bike to his house, parked by the curb, and called his cell from outside. I could see his window from where I sat. The phone rang twice. Then, for the first time in days, he answered. But he didn't say anything. "Ryan, you there?" Nothing, just the faint sound of breathing. "You okay?" I asked. Still silence. Just that slow, steady breathing through the line. And then click. He hung up. At first, I felt crushed. Thought maybe he was done being friends with me. Maybe I'd hurt his feelings that night. But when I looked up toward his window, I froze. The curtain moved. Someone pulled it back just enough for me to see. It was Ryan, but he didn't look like Ryan anymore. His skin was pale, almost gray. His face hollow, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes wide, empty, like he was trying to remember how to be human. He scanned the street, then locked eyes with me. I lifted my hand to wave, but stopped halfway. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Then he disappeared behind the curtain again. I just sat there on my bike, staring at that window, my stomach twisting. Whatever was happening to Ryan, it wasn't just the flu. I tried calling again and again. I asked my mom to talk to his mom, thinking maybe she'd open up to another adult. But every time, we got the same answer. He's sick. He's resting. He'll be back soon. Eventually, I started to think my mom was hiding something too. That maybe she knew what was really going on but didn't want to tell me. I asked her outright. She got mad, told me to drop it. Then I told her about the text. "Hello, meat pliers." She frowned, said it was probably some weird prank. But the next day, she called Ryan's mom again. When she got off the phone, her face looked pale. She said Ryan's family was moving away, soon. I asked why his mom lied about him being sick. Mom just sighed and said, "Parents protect their kids however they can. Sometimes lying spares more pain than the truth." But I'd seen his face. It wasn't just a lie. Something had happened to him that night, something bad enough that his family had to vanish. Years later, I tried searching for him online. No Facebook, no Instagram, nothing. Like he'd been erased. And sometimes, when I can't sleep, I still think about that text. "Hello, meat pliers." And I wonder if in his panic he'd been typing something else. Something his shaking fingers had turned into nonsense. Maybe what he meant to say was, "Help me, please." One of the most unforgettable things that ever happened during my childhood took place on Halloween night. A few friends and I were out trick-or-treating, and we'd pretty much hit every neighborhood within walking distance. Then on the way back, we ended up passing by a place that had an almost legendary reputation in our area. For as long as any of us could remember, there'd been this old house over in the next neighborhood, one that sat close enough to the other homes to feel familiar, yet far enough away to feel isolated. It was separated by an overgrown front yard and a long, cracked driveway lined with weeds and half-dead trees. We'd never seen anyone there. No cars, no lights, no movement, ever. We figured someone owned it, but nobody ever visited. What we knew, what we were certain of, was that the place was haunted. If you'd seen it at 13, you'd probably think the same thing. Hell, even if you saw it at 30, you'd probably still think some ghost lived there. The house just looked haunted, all gothic and old-fashioned, the kind of place you'd expect the Addams family to call home. Naturally, a bunch of over-imaginative kids like us were convinced it was crawling with long-dead spirits. As we walked by, our laughter faded and we went quiet, just taking it all in. That's when my friend Eli slowed to a stop. I can still remember the grin spreading across his face before he said, "How much candy will you give me if I knock on that door?" We all stopped dead in our tracks. "No way," someone muttered. "You're not actually gonna do it." But Eli grinned wider and said he'd bet his entire bag of candy that he would. None of us wanted to take that bet. He looked way too serious. He wasn't bluffing. He was actually going to ding-dong ditch the creepiest house in town. Still, I couldn't resist. I offered him a handful of my candy if he didn't do it. Two of our other friends, Miles and Connor, followed suit. The bets were in, and with a sort of cocky swagger, Eli headed down that long driveway. We stood at the end, watching him go. The further he walked, the smaller he looked, the darker it got. When he reached the door, he turned back and gave us a look, half trying to seem brave, half visibly nervous. I heard one of us whisper, "Told you he wouldn't do it." But Eli must have heard that too, because right then, he balled up his fist and knocked on the door. Someone gasped. At that point, I didn't even care about candy anymore. Eli had just banged on the door of a haunted house. We all watched in silence as he backed away, ready to sprint. But nothing happened. The door stayed shut. The windows stayed dark. The house was as silent as before. The longer it stayed that way, the more confident Eli got. He stopped, turned around, and walked right back up to the front door, this time knocking again, louder and with a playful rhythm. "Do-do," he hummed. We started laughing at how bold he was being. When Eli saw us laughing, that only fueled him. He knocked again, even harder, and shouted, "Hello? Anyone home?" As kids, we thought it was hilarious. That tension we'd all been feeling suddenly broke. Eli went on shouting, saying if a ghost didn't come out and give him a treat, he was going to give them a trick they'd regret. Then he started yelling about bringing back holy water and sprinkling it all over the place so no ghost could live there anymore. By now, we were doubled over laughing. One of us yelled, "All right, man, you win. Come grab your candy, let's go." But Eli wasn't done. He started dancing on the porch, singing the Ghostbusters theme at the top of his lungs. I ain't afraid of no ghosts. We were losing it. I remember laughing so hard my sides hurt. But then, just as I looked up, I saw it. The door behind Eli slowly creaked open. The laughter stopped immediately. Eli spun around just in time for a shadowy figure to lunge out, grab him, and pull him inside. He screamed loud, but it didn't help. The thing yanked him into the house and slammed the door shut. Silence. The moment that door slammed, the rest of us bolted down the driveway, screaming his name. We didn't even think, it was pure instinct. But by the time we reached the porch, the door was locked tight. There was no way we were breaking in, so we ran for help instead. There were a couple of houses nearby, so we sprinted to the closest one and banged on the door until a grumpy-looking man answered. The four of us started shouting all at once, panicked and hysterical. I'll never forget his face. He took one look at us and knew something was seriously wrong. He rushed inside, called the cops, and barked at us to shut up while he spoke to the dispatcher. We waited with him in the front yard, trembling and watching the road until the sound of sirens filled the air. Then we ran straight back toward the old house as two patrol cars pulled up. We pleaded with the officers to save Eli. They told us to stay back as they walked up the driveway and banged on the door. My friend Connor shouted, "Kick it open." He's in there. But the cops didn't. They just kept knocking and announcing themselves. Each second felt like torture. We were certain Eli was in danger, maybe worse, and these guys were acting like it was a noise complaint. We started yelling again, begging them to go inside. And just as one of them raised his hand to knock again, the door swung open. A man stepped out, and standing beside him was Eli. We couldn't hear what they were saying, but the cops were talking to both of them. Eli just stood there, nodding or shaking his head to their questions. After a few minutes, the man went back inside. The hallway behind him was suddenly bright with light, like the place had never been abandoned at all. The door closed, and the cops escorted Eli back to us. We were too stunned to say a word. One of the officers said, "You boys are lucky that gentleman was home to help your friend out. Things could have been a lot worse." We were speechless. What was he talking about? We tried to explain what really happened. That Eli had been grabbed and dragged inside, but the cops just frowned and told us not to make up stories. They said we'd probably been trying to prank the man because he wouldn't give us candy. It hit us then. That thing inside had tricked them somehow. Miles got angry and tried to explain everything from start to finish, but before he could get far, Eli cut him off. "Dude," he said, "we shouldn't make up stuff like that. It's not cool." We froze. None of us could believe what we just heard. The cops told us it was time to head home, and if they caught us causing trouble again, they'd personally deliver us to our parents. We didn't argue. We just left. As we walked, we kept asking Eli what really happened in that house. Finally, he said it was dark inside at first, and that the man had hurt him. He said the man made him tell his name, where he lived, where his family slept, and where he went to school, promising each time that the pain would stop if he told the truth. But each answer was followed by more pain. Eli said the man made him reveal everything personal about himself. Then, before letting him go, he whispered that if Eli ever came near that house again, or told anyone what he saw inside, he'd burn Eli's home to the ground while his family slept. We begged him to tell the cops, but Eli just shook his head. He said the man told him they had people everywhere, and he didn't want to risk finding out if that was true. We asked what he'd seen, what was in the house that man didn't want him to talk about, but Eli got angry. He said he'd never speak of it, not ever. And he didn't. A few years later, when we brought it up again, he still wouldn't share the details. All he said was that what he saw was bad. Really bad. Bad enough to understand why the man said he'd kill him if he talked. He said they weren't normal, and they weren't good. Sometimes, the rest of us would talk about it among ourselves, but only when Eli wasn't around. Sometimes we wondered if he'd exaggerated. But the truth was, Eli wasn't that kind of guy. His story never changed, not once. And he never went anywhere near Hollow Ridge Lane again. If he'd made it all up, he wouldn't have been that terrified for years. Eventually, we grew up, went to different colleges, and lost touch. But even now, I think about that night, about what Eli saw inside that house. Whatever it was, it scared him so deeply that he never spoke of it again. And I still wonder what could be so horrifying, that it silenced him for life. Last September, I somehow landed what I can only describe as a dream job. The company was based in the Pacific Northwest, and since I was living out in Chicago, I'd applied half-jokingly because the pay was absurdly good. They actually called me, interviewed me, and when I didn't hear back for a few weeks, I assumed they'd passed. But then out of nowhere, they called again and told me I'd gotten the job. I didn't mention that I'd only applied on a whim, but I did say that moving across the country might be complicated for me. I thought that would make them consider other candidates. Instead, they said they'd cover a year of free housing until I got settled. And it wasn't just some shabby apartment. It was a small but beautiful house. Not huge, but cozy and well kept from what I could tell in the photos. So, in less than 24 hours, that random job application completely changed my life. A few weeks later, I'd packed up, moved to Oregon, and started the new gig. And I fell in love with my new place immediately. It was the first time I'd ever lived in an actual house, not an apartment. Growing up, I always assumed I'd be stuck in high-rises until I was middle-aged. So having my own house felt like a milestone, like I'd finally crossed into adulthood. When October rolled around, I realized something else. Halloween was coming up fast. and I was weirdly excited. Back in the city, trick-or-treating wasn't really a thing. Apartment buildings rarely got visitors. Unless you left a candy bowl in the lobby, no one came by. Halloween was always more of a suburban event, and now that I lived in a neighborhood, I finally got to experience it. So as late October crept closer, I started preparing. I carved a pumpkin, bought a mountain of fun-sized candy bars, and decorated my front windows, just enough to catch the eye of passing trick-or-treaters. And it worked. From around 5:30 to 8 p.m., I had at least 24 groups come by. I saw a little Waldo, a tiny Beetlejuice, a couple of cowboys, and even a kid who looked like the main guy from The Bear, complete with that exhausted, I need a nap expression. One 10-year-old dressed as Michael. Mayors made me genuinely wonder how he even knew who that was. But the best costumes of the night had to be two kids dressed as Mario and Luigi, both short, round, and almost perfectly proportioned like the real thing. After that, the crowd started thinning out. Not wanting to be interrupted while cooking or showering, I just put a bowl of candy on the front window ledge for any latecomers to help themselves. About an hour later, around 9 p.m., I just settled on the couch, flipping through Netflix to find a horror movie. Bathrobe on, beer in one hand, remote in the other. When I heard it, a soft tapping on my kitchen window. The kitchen and living room were connected, so all I had to do was turn my head, and there it was. Someone standing just outside the glass. I figured it was a late trick-or-rater, probably some kid being a smartass, showing off to his friends by knocking instead of using the doorbell. I actually chuckled to myself thinking, nice one, kid. That's exactly what I would have done, half expecting to see some teenager jump up in a cheap mask. I pulled the blinds aside, and my heart nearly stopped. Standing there in the dim streetlight was a man, not a kid, wearing a black ski mask and dark clothing. And he was pointing what looked like a sawed-off shotgun directly at the window. For maybe a second, no longer than a blink, I locked eyes with him. But that moment stretched forever in my memory. I remember how the cheap knit of his mask shimmered faintly under the light. I remember how bright his eyes looked, almost too white. And that gun, short, worn, old, like it had been passed around for years. Then instinct kicked in. I dropped flat to the floor so fast I bruised my arms and legs on the hardwood. I waited for the shot. I thought any second the window would explode, the blast tearing through me. But the shot never came. Time warped. I couldn't tell if I'd been on the floor for seconds or minutes. My heart pounded in my ears so loudly that I almost didn't hear it when it finally came. A car door slamming, followed by the roar of an engine. The sound faded down the street. Silence returned. Still, I didn't get up right away. I just lay there, paralyzed, listening. When I finally dared to move, I crept back to the blinds and peeked outside. The street was empty again, nothing but parked cars and soft orange streetlights. Once my legs stopped shaking enough to hold me, I grabbed my phone and called 911. That call was disappointingly uneventful. After taking my report, the cops basically told me that if I didn't feel safe, I should go stay at a hotel. Which, obviously, I didn't feel safe. But hearing, "don't like it, then leave," from the people who were supposed to protect me was like getting punched in the gut. So that night, I booked a hotel room. The next morning, I went to work with one hell of a story to tell. I figured I'd stay at the hotel again the following night. No way was I going back there until I knew what was going on. But then, late that afternoon, I got a call from a police officer. Not one of the ones I'd spoken to before. This guy said he worked for the gang task force. He told me he'd reviewed the report and thought he could explain what happened. According to him, the house I'd been placed in used to belong to members of a local gang, and they'd moved out just weeks before I arrived. The guy with the shotgun? He hadn't fired because he realized I wasn't who he was looking for. Apparently, the moment he saw a stranger inside instead of his target, he backed off. Rather than hit a civilian and bring the entire police department down on them, he jumped back into the getaway car and vanished. The officer said he didn't think I'd be targeted again. Once they knew the house was occupied by a random newcomer, they'd move on. But honestly, that didn't make me feel any better. Back in my Chicago apartment, I'd always felt safe, even during the craziest nights. I was 3 stories up, separated from the chaos below. But in that little house, I realized how exposed I was. Anyone could just walk up, tap on my window, and point a gun through the glass. That thought haunted me for weeks. Eventually, I started to relax again, but every time I heard a noise outside, especially a faint tap, 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 my chest would tighten, and my stomach would turn to ice. Because even though logic told me it was over, I'll never forget the feeling of seeing that masked face staring through my window, and knowing that if he'd wanted to, I'd be gone. The scariest event of my entire childhood took place on Halloween night. I was out trick-or-treating with a few friends, and we were making our way toward the neighborhood known for its big houses and long, winding driveways. We'd gotten full-sized candy bars from a couple of those houses the year before, so as you can imagine, we were pretty excited to get back there before they ran out. A lot of those big homes really got into the Halloween spirit, but they were spaced apart, so we had to walk past 4 or 5 of them before spotting one decked out with decorations. We hit one house, then another, but eventually had to walk almost a full block before we came across another that looked like it was handing out candy. My friends and I started walking up the driveway, and the place looked incredibly inviting. There weren't just one, but 2 carved pumpkins sitting out front, and whoever decorated the porch clearly spared no expense. Plastic bats hung from the ceiling, creepy rubber vines wrapped around the porch columns, and fake cobwebs draped across the doorframe. It looked amazing, like something out of a Halloween movie, so I was expecting nothing less than a warm welcome and a handful of those coveted full-size candy bars. Instead, we got something that sent us sprinting back down the driveway in sheer terror. I remember pressing the doorbell, but I didn't hear anything. I figured it might have been one of those electric bells that only make a soft ding inside the house. When no one answered after a few seconds, I assumed it was broken. So I raised my hand to knock, only to have the door creak open slightly on its own. It wasn't locked. It was just open. We all exchanged confused glances. It was strange, unsettling even. I knocked again and called out, "Hello? Anyone home?" No one answered. The only sound came from a television somewhere deeper inside, muffled and low. The silence made my skin crawl. One of my friends whispered that we should just leave, and honestly, I felt it too, that heavy, crawling sense that we shouldn't be there. That something wasn't right, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I just couldn't walk away without looking inside. I slowly pushed the door open with my fingertip. One of my friends hissed, "Dude, what are you doing?" But I didn't listen. The door swung open just enough for me to peek in. I called out again, hoping to see someone walking down the hallway maybe. Just another neighbor who'd forgotten to close their door after giving out candy. But instead, what I saw made my stomach drop. An older woman was lying on the floor. From where I stood, all I could see were the bottoms of her shoes. My friend gasped and called out softly, asking if she was okay. She didn't move. For a second, I was sure she was dead. But then, she suddenly sat up, snapping upright, like something in a nightmare. Her eyes, they looked blank. Not at us, but through us. That wasn't the worst part, though. What made us scream and bolt down the driveway was the blood. It was running down from a deep gash on her forehead, right where her hairline started. And as she sat there staring, she let out this rasping, guttural groan that didn't sound human. The first of us to turn and run started screaming, "Zombie! It's a zombie!" at the top of his lungs. I blame my little kid brain for that reaction. But honestly, for a few seconds, I believed it. I really thought I was staring at the living dead. Then, logic caught up. There was no way she'd come back from the dead. She was hurt badly and needed help. My friend was still shouting about zombies when we ran up the driveway of the house across the street. I had to tell him to shut up before anyone came to the door, otherwise they'd think we were pulling some dumb Halloween prank. When a man finally opened the door, I started yelling that he needed to call an ambulance because a lady across the street was hurt. He yelled for his wife to dial 911, and then we all ran back over together. By the time we got there, the woman was sitting on her porch, pressing something to her forehead to stop the bleeding. She looked more awake now, able to speak between shaky breaths. The man who'd come to help called her Mrs. Dalka, asking her what happened. She told him that some man had hit her the moment she opened the door. Apparently, he'd been wearing an oversized Halloween costume mask and all, and struck her over the head with something heavy. When she tried to tell him to leave, she thanked us over and over for getting help, saying that if we came by the next night, she'd give us all her leftover candy for being such good boys. And we did. The next night, there she was, bandaged, wrapped around her head, smiling weakly and handing us extra candy while her husband thanked us again for what we'd done. I'm grateful everything turned out okay. We all were. But back then, it was one of the most terrifying things I'd ever experienced. I was at that age where I could understand what I was seeing, but my mind couldn't process the horror of it. For a moment, I truly believed I'd witnessed the dead come back to life. But now I know what the real horror was, that when someone's gone, they're gone, and there's no coming back.